I put our audio on just long enough for us to say hello. We're going to be eating supper here, so rather than clanking at you, I'm going to put the mute on.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
So,
Okay. Says we're live. It's being live streamed. Okay, got it. Okay, well, it is about 7 o'clock. Thank you everyone for joining us. We've got a couple people on already, and I'll banter a little bit while we're getting everyone else on. My name is Hannah. I am a board member with the Friends of Haystack Rock here in Cannon Beach, Oregon. I'm so happy that you all have joined us today for this February library lecture. You know, I feel like it's still the new year, but it's February already. So we're about almost a month and a half in. And, you know, it's been a beautiful couple days here in Cannon Beach. We had one rainy day. I guess that was yesterday already. But besides that, it has been absolutely gorgeous here in Cannon Beach. I haven't had a chance to get down to the Rock to see what's going on down there. But, you know, this weekend is supposed to be sunny. So hopefully I can make it down there. And if you're in the area, hopefully you can make it down too to see what's going on at Haystack. So the Friends of Haystack Rock, you know, we are here to promote education and stewardship and all those wonderful things about Haystack and the Marine Garden and our environmental area around here. And so we are so excited to have Dr. Taylor Chappell today to talk about sharks. But in a moment, before he gets going, I just want to have a couple housekeeping items. If you have any questions, please comment them on the Friends of Haystack Rock Facebook Live event that you're watching this on, and we'll make sure to ask those questions at the end of the presentation. So you got to stay tuned for those answers. We'll also comment answers as needed in the chat as well. Also, if you would prefer to watch this with captions, Facebook has an option for that, which is really cool. So please, if you would like the captions on, there's a setting to turn that on, and it is very handy. I'm watching myself talk right now, so it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. So thank you all so much for joining us. We are excited to have you here. The puffins haven't come back yet, but we're anticipating them in a couple more months. But there's lots of other things to see at Haystack Rock and in our area. So without further ado, Taylor, would you care to take it away?
Awesome, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I will share my screen and hopefully you all can see that. Can I get a thumbs up? Can everyone see that and hear me?
You are all good.
All right, awesome, wonderful. Well, thanks. I'm happy to be here. I am an assistant professor down at OSU out of Newport, and I've been here for that's almost 2.5 years. And so I've been studying sharks and large fish for, I don't know, about the last 20 years or so. And so today I'm going to talk about really the science behind, I guess, behind sharks and behind shark research. And so I'm going to start a little bit about some work that I've done in the past that's relevant here, and then some of the work that my lab and folks at OSU are doing to start to understand a little bit more about sharks on our coast here. So this is the iconic image that everybody thinks of when you hear the word shark or you go to the beach, or most people when they go to the beach. And this is, as you all are probably very familiar with, that cover photo from Jaws. And this is the type of, I guess, idea that has really been propagated in social media, in popular media, and really is what I want to share with you, or try to convince you a little bit of today, is that this isn't the right story to be telling, that these animals are way more exciting and way more complex than this sort of simplification gives. These animals are predators, and they're very good at that, but they're also not these sort of mindless predators or mindless monsters that Hollywood would make them out to be. They're more than just these, that we sort of couch these different sort of predatory species, whether it's a tiger or a shark, as jaws and claws. And so these animals are more than just jaws and claws. They have really complex behaviors and life history and things like that that make them really cool, but also make them really important for the ecosystems that we all love. So our backyards. And so instead of thinking about them as teeth and jumping out of the water and eating people and eating everything that's out there, I want to hopefully today instill a little bit about what's more in depth about them and what really is their value in our ecosystems. And the truth is that you're way more likely to die from a selfie than you are to die from a shark attack, or even be more likely to even be attacked by a shark. So I always ask people, like, if you've ever seen, Discovery Channel dedicate an entire week to death by selfie, but they will do it to sharks. So it's a lot about what popular media teaches to us. But the truth is that you're more likely to interact with a shark in this way than in a negative way for you. And these are just some of the products and things that we derive from sharks. So on the top there is a fishing boat that I was on in the Southeast US, where there was still a shark fishery. And so basically I was a scientist aboard this boat that was out commercial fishing for the sharks, and they'd take the fins and send the fins to the Asian market for what you see in the bottom right corner there, which is shark fin soup. And so that's what's driven basically about 100 million sharks a year being pulled out of our oceans. And then there's a few other products here like shark cartilage or beauty products that are derived from sharks. So again, that's more likely to be the way that you're going to ever interact with a shark than one of these ways that's depicted in popular media or Hollywood. And so as scientists, we were looking at these data in sort of this general fear of sharks, and we wanted to say, well, is this fear, is it valid? I guess I shouldn't say valid. Is the fear misplaced, or is really the risk of shark attack equal to the amount of fear that people feel when entering the water? And if we look at the unprovoked shark attacks, so these are the attacks that a provoked shark attack would be somebody that's holding a fish in the water in front of a shark and it bites them. But these are unprovoked shark attacks, and this is based on the International Shark Attack File. And so that we saw over time that the number of attacks, and this is worldwide in this figure. So as you see over time from left to right there, that you're going through time and that the number of attacks are increasing. And so we said, well, is that the whole story? And so to do that, we wanted to look at a metric of shark attacks that we knew would be fairly well represented. And so we went to California, where a lot of the work that I do is, and we looked at white shark attacks on people. And we knew that over time, those have been well documented based on the history of human habitation in California. And so we looked over time and saw that if you look at this figure on the top here, that over time, that the number of attacks were in fact increasing. And so you don't have to pay too much attention. Just know that from left to right, that's time from 1950 to present, or a little bit before present. And then there's the number of attacks is on the left side. So those green dots are the number of attacks in a given year, but you're just following that dotted black line there. And that's telling you that the number is actually increasing. But again, is that the full story? Is there something else that we should be thinking about when we're telling the story about increasing attacks? Ooh. And it turns out that there's other contributing factors that might be affecting the number of attacks that we see. And so this is just over that same time period, the millions of people that lived in coastal communities in California. So what we did is we broke it down and said, okay, well, let's look at California and look at the number of attacks. And then we also want to look at the types of groups that are interacting with sharks. And we broke that down into 4 different groups. So you have these different, what we call ocean activities. And there's a little picture on the right side of your screen of what each of those are. So you've got scuba diving, surfing, swimming, and then abalone diving. And for those of you that aren't familiar, abalone is basically it's like a one-sided clam that sticks to rocks, and people go out and you dive down, you free dive down to pull them off. And so we looked at how many of each of those people were entering the water over time. And what we see is that, as you can imagine, from 1950 until 2013, the numbers of all of those activities in the ocean were increasing. So if we took that into account and match that up with a number of attacks on or interactions with people doing those different activities, we actually found that the number of your probability of being attacked was going down precipitously. So this figure I just put up, which is the red and the gray and things, don't worry about any specifics. You just see that the general trend of it is going down. So once we take into account the number of people actually entering the water, the probability of attack for all of these different ocean groups, so ocean users, go down. So basically from 1950 or 60 until the present, your probability of ever having a negative interaction with a shark has gone down by about 90%. But that's not what we hear about in the media. It's those single individual attacks that cause a big stir, because that is a very traumatic moment for the people involved. But overall, the risk of being attacked by a shark has gone down precipitously. So I like to get that out there to start with, and just say that some of the fear that we sort of associate with the ocean and with sharks might not be as well placed as it needs to be. So I'll step away from that, and I'm going to start talking a little bit more now about some of the shark research and behavior. And so when I first got here, a number of people asked me, and they said, "Are there really sharks off of the coast of Oregon?" And I said, "There are. We just haven't done a whole lot of work yet to understand a lot about them here." And so honestly, the Pacific Northwest has had a few studies on sharks, but it's vastly unstudied. And so that's what my lab and folks in the Big Fish Lab at OSU have been trying to do, and will continue to, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is an awesome shark ID that came from Sea Grants, and it's available on our on the webpage at OSU at the Big Fish Lab. They've let us use it so that folks can use this to identify different sharks that they see or may have seen in Oregon. So this just gives a brief outline of what those animals look like, and then some more facts and information about them if you want to go to that website. So I'm going to start this talk out talking about the white shark, or in this picture, it's called the great white shark. And this is a shark that I've been working on for about 15 or 20 years. And the majority of this work has been in California, with some work in South Africa and Cape Cod and other places. So I'm going to focus on some of that work, but it's really applicable as those animals are making their way up here. And so I'll tie all that in together sort of at the end, and we'll talk more about some of the other species that we're currently working on. So with the white shark, they're a globally distributed predator, and there are 6 known known populations of these species. So genetically distinct individual populations, and those are the Northwest Atlantic, so off of Cape Cod and down to Florida. There's the Mediterranean, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the Northwest Pacific, so off of Japan, and then our region, the Northeast Pacific, which basically it spans from Hawaii to Baja California, and up as far as the Puget Sound. And there actually have been animals that have been caught up in Alaska. And so I just want to give a little bit of background about these animals, just that we understand them a little bit more. Their length at birth is about 1.2 to 1.5 meters. And so that's somewhere about 4 feet. And a litter size is between 3 and 14 animals. And you'll see some of these have question marks with them. And that's because these are our best guesses based on observations, but they're things that we're not certain of. And so you might find it sort of interesting that there's these characteristics that you would think would be basic things to know about a species that we still don't. And that's because they're so cryptic. They spend so much time offshore and in deep water that they're very difficult to study. So one of the coolest parts about white sharks is that they're regional endotherms. And what that means is basically they can elevate and moderate their internal temperature. So the same way that we're 98.6 degrees, no matter what environment that we're in, these white sharks are the same. And so this is really unique in the ocean, because if you all have ever been swimming, you know how quickly you lose your heat. You actually lose it about 25 times faster. And so being an endotherm in the ocean is really rare unless you're a mammal. Mammals have big blubber layers, whereas sharks don't. And so they have a really cool physiology that allows them to stay warm. What does that do for them? It makes them incredibly metabolically advanced so that they can be really dynamic in cold water. So you can imagine if you took a snake and set it outside in a cold environment, it's going to be really slow moving. It's because its body is cold, like the outside environment is. But if you put a snake outside that's really warm, then that animal is it's able to move a lot faster, because it's basically its warm metabolism allows it to be more dynamic. And so that's what the regional endothermy allows these white sharks to do, so that they're chasing down big marine mammal prey as they're swimming around and super agile, and the sharks are able to basically keep up. They go through what we call an ontogenetic shift. And this means that when they're born at that 1 to 1.5 meters length, they have a certain dentition and a certain behavior, and they're basically foraging on fish and sharks and crustaceans and cephalopods. And then when they hit to about 7 or 9 feet, so about 2.5 meters, they switch. Their dentition changes where they get these big triangular teeth, and then their behavior changes where they start focusing on marine mammals. And that's a really cool thing, because they switch environments that when they're small, because they're endothermic, they have to stay in warm water or else they lose too much heat too quickly. But as they get bigger, they get thermal inertia. So they have a lot less surface area to volume, and they're able to go up in colder waters like where we are to chase marine mammals. Their gestation is between 12 and 18 months, and they probably take a year off. So a female will give birth probably every 3 years, probably at best. And their populations in all of these different genetically distinct populations are in the hundreds to low thousands, which is a really impressive number when you think about the number of lions and on the African Serengeti. It's a surprisingly low number, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And their maximum age is somewhere around 70 years. And I'm happy to talk about how we age sharks later, because there's a lot of cool different ways that we do it. But this is our new best guess. This is just a few years old that they live up to about 70 years. And then they make these massive migrations, which again, we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So the work that I'm going to talk about is mostly from California with a little bit from South Africa. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with the sharks in our backyard? It turns out that many of the sharks that are prowling the waters of California are making movements up here. And so we'll talk about how we're tracking those movements and what that sort of means for the Oregon ecosystems and coastlines in a little bit. So this work mainly focused on 3 spots in California, and that was a spot called Tomales Bay, just north of San Francisco, the Farallon Islands, which if anyone knows white sharks on the West Coast, they've probably heard of the Farallons, and then another spot called Año Nuevo, which is about 25 miles north of Santa Cruz. And then the spot in South Africa is a spot called Shark Alley, which is almost at this very southern tip of South Africa. And so in order to understand and to study these animals, we have to be able to find them. And so we do that by focusing on aggregation areas. So areas we know that they're going for a resource. And it turns out that the spots that we're looking at are places that we expect that they're going for food. So the resource they're looking at these places is food. So we exploit that searching behavior. So we make basically a model of the thing they're looking for. So this is some folks making a seal decoy, which is basically just indoor-outdoor carpet that looks like a seal. And then at the same time, we use a small bit of marine mammal as bait. And so this is a sperm whale that washed up on the beach. Unfortunately, it had an entire squid net in its stomach, which had likely led to its, or it contributed to its death. But we were able to take small pieces, so about, maybe a kilogram or 2, and use that as an incentive to get the animals near the boat. And so when we do this work, it's not the big chumming that you see on Jaws or on Shark Week, where you're ladling blood and guts and all sorts of things in the water. What we're doing is a small localized piece of bait. So an animal, a shark, sees that decoy. They're really adept visual predators. They see that decoy at the surface and they investigate it. And at that same time they come to investigate it, they smell that little bit of bait that we have in the water. And it allows us enough time to collect some of the data that we use to understand them. So this is a picture of one of those sharks coming up. You'll see my colleague that's standing up with a fishing pole is retrieving that decoy. He's actually the same one that's making the decoy in the top photo, just 10 years later. It might be the same sweatshirt and everything. So he's pulling that decoy in, the shark's following it in, and then one colleague with the blue hat is taking videos and photographs of the dorsal fins, which are basically like a fingerprint, which we'll talk about in a second. And then I'm on the back with a type of tag that we're trying to attach to the dorsal fin of the shark. And so this all happens very, very quickly. The animals come up. They're usually only around for 20 or 30 seconds. And that's the time that we have to really get tags on, to take photographs, and to do the work that we need to do. And so one of the first things that we did with the white sharks is to try to understand a little bit about their abundance. So we didn't know anything about these animals at all. And so we said, well, how many of these animals are actually off of our coast? And as I said before, we take photographs of the dorsal fins because each of them is unique. So each shark has a unique print on the trailing edge of its fin. And some like to think of it as a fingerprint. Other people think of it as a sort of a barcode, like when you go to the grocery store. And it's conserved over time. So this is an animal that was, excuse me, photographed about 4 years apart. And you can see all those notches, peaks and valleys along that fin are the same over that period of time. So we're able to identify individuals over time. So we just finished a study up just last year, which was an update on some earlier work that I had done, but estimating the abundance of animals off of Central California, and found out that the number of these animals, of subadults and adults, so the animals that are feeding on marine mammals, is only about 260. And so there's a few other spots in the whole Northeast Pacific where these animals aggregate. So this isn't the entire population, but it's probably a pretty significant portion of the white sharks that are off of the west coast of the US and Mexico. Or I guess I could just say, oh, the west coast of North America. So that was our first look at the abundance of these animals, but we wanted to start to understand a little bit more of them. And historically, our way to understand white sharks was these moments where they came up. What I just showed you, the shark comes up to the decoy, it comes to the boat, we take pictures and collect what data we can. But those are only a few brief seconds of that animal's day. So basically, if you took those 30 seconds that we see the animal, it would be that red line on this figure. But you have this whole other 24-hour period that you're trying to understand based on that very teeny tiny moment. And I like to say it's like if you came down in the morning and opened up the refrigerator and I took a photo of you, I'd be hard pressed to describe what you did the whole rest of your day based on that one single photo of you in front of the refrigerator. And so that's the same type of thing that we're trying to do with the sharks, about understanding any more about their life history from just those moments. So what we needed to do is be able to go on board with them, to be with them at the times that they weren't at the surface interacting with the decoy or interacting with their food. And so this is when some new really cool technologies came into play. And so the first one of those is an acoustic tag. And I happen to have one in front of me right here. So these acoustic tags are really incredible because they send off a unique acoustic identifier. And so you put this onto the back of a shark. So it basically gets inserted into the muscle in their back. And for the next 4 or 5 years, this tag will send every 30 seconds or every 60 seconds a unique identifier that says, I am shark 64, I am shark 64. But the caveat about that is that this tag itself doesn't record anything. You have to have a receiver placed in the water to listen for that. So we put receivers in places that we thought sharks would be, and anytime a shark with a tag on it swims by, this tag will send an acoustic signal. And you may ask, well, why do you do that? Why don't you just put a GPS collar on them? Well, it turns out that GPS signal can't get through that air-water interface. And so if an animal is underwater all the time, it can never actually connect to the satellites. So you'd never have a position. So we have to come up with different ways in order to understand where these animals are. And if you look at the picture on the bottom, right under at the base of the dorsal fin, you'll see one of these tags sort of in the back of the animal as it swims by. It's a little circle of it there. So what do we find out from these tags? Well, this gives us a lot of great information about the residency of these animals. So remember, again, we put receivers in the water to listen for those tags. The signal only travels about 1 kilometer. So we put receivers in the water, and whenever a shark comes within 1 kilometer, it says that it's there. And this is just an example of the data that we would collect from that. And so if you look on the bottom axis, you'll see dates, and those are months of the year. And on the Y up the left side there, those are detections per day. So basically what this is showing you that the number of detections per day increase in September, October, November, December, and then they drop back down in March, April, May. And that is the same basically behavior that we see every year, is that there's this peak in the number of animals that are detected at the coast where we have receivers. And then those detections fade off during the spring and summer months. And so it's really interesting for us to look at the seasonal predictivity or predictability of those sharks. But what you'll notice is what it doesn't show is where those sharks are when they're not at the coast. And those are those big gaps. And that's the problem with this tag that requires you to have some idea ahead of time where the animals are. So we needed a different technology that would allow us to understand where these animals are when we didn't have a preconceived idea about where they would be. And so in comes the tag called a satellite tag, or a PAT tag, a pop-off satellite tag. And these are amazing. And actually, I think I have one in front of me. So this is what it looks like. It's got a float on the top, and this one does the same thing. It will attach to the back of a shark. You can see one on that same picture on the very bottom with a circle on it now. And this is a really novel tag because it records temperature, it records depth, and it records light level, and it stores it all inside this tag. So it's basically like an onboard computer. And then at some preset time, it will pop itself off of the shark and then transmit the data up to a satellite. And what's really important about it is the light indicator. And you might say, well, why does it have a light indicator on it? Well, remember I said that we can't use GPS signal to understand where the animals are going. So instead, we go back to the old school way that ancient mariners used to navigate, figure out where they were. And so wherever you are on the planet, your local noon is that midpoint between sunrise and sunset. So no matter how far west or east you go, you have a local noon. And so ancient mariners used to say, all right, we know what time it is. We know when noon is in Greenwich, so Greenwich Mean Time. And we know when local noon is where we are. And so by knowing how different those times are, they could tell how far east or west they were basically on the globe. And so we use that same type of technology with a little bit more information about temperature and things like that to figure out where the animal is. And so with those data, we were able to figure out where these sharks were going when they weren't at the coast. And this is a quick video of what that looks like. So the sharks started off at the coast, and they were making these massive migrations, some of them going as far as Hawaii, and the rest of them going to the spot in the middle of the Pacific. And this is a spot that we have called the White Shark Cafe. And again, I'll show that again. So you can see some sharks that were leaving from Guadalupe Island, part of the same population that move out to that cafe, and then the sharks from Central California. And every year those sharks would go out and then they'd show back up. So remember that first figure of the every year periodicity. So they would come back in the fall, and then they'd go offshore in the spring and summer, and then they'd come back. And we said, well, all right, these animals are leaving the California coast, right? They're leaving this incredibly, the California current is this incredibly rich ecosystem, right? There's tons of things to eat if you're a white shark. All of us have seen seals and sea lions and everything else out in the ocean that would be potential food for white sharks. We said, so why are these animals leaving this location every year? They're going out to what we thought was the middle of nowhere. And so we came up with two ideas. And one was that there's a better food source out there. So there's, in the middle of the ocean, there's something that they're going to that's better than the California currents. And the other idea is that they're going out to mate. And so that's why we called it the cafe, is because the cafe is the type of place that you could either go grab a bite to eat or you could go meet somebody. And so our goal was to say, well, how do we figure that out? How do we understand what the difference is between the California or the California current system and this offshore area of water that we thought was basically a dead zone? And so one of the first tools that we used to look at this was isotopes. And that the old mantra of "you are what you eat" really holds up, because basically the types of foods and the area that you get foods from shows up in the signature of your tissues. And so isotopes are naturally occurring elements. So if you imagine carbon, we all know about carbon dating. That's using isotopes in order to understand how old something is. So we can basically look at the signature of an animal's tissue in different regions and tell if it's been eating there or if not. So if you imagine the fundamental processes the fundamental like productive processes, so plants, different regions will have different isotopic signatures in those primary producers. And then if you are plankton that gets eaten by a herring, then the herring is going to show that it's been eating the isotopic signature of that plankton. If you are a tuna that comes in and eats that herring, you're going to show the isotopic signature of the herring and of that plankton. And so we can go out and we can take samples of the sharks and basically figure out where they've been eating. And so this is just a little diagram. Imagine that the isotopic signature from the coast is green. So the primary producers there have a green isotopic signature. So if a shark's feeding there, it's going to look green too. Instead, if you're a shark that's feeding off in Hawaii, the isotopic signature out there is blue in the primary producers. So you're going to look blue. But if you're an animal that eats a little bit in both of those places, you're going to look like a perfect mix of those two things. So imagine that we're instead of being colors, that we're looking at the isotopic signature. And so what we did is we looked at the signature of different prey in different regions. And so prey that lives in California would be in this type of signature. So we're looking at carbon and nitrogen. You don't have to worry about that too much. Just know that you're on these sort of different scales of these isotopes. But if you were in California, you would have a green signature. If you were in the pelagic environment, which is basically that cafe region, pelagic means offshore waters, then you would be blue and you would be around all of these fish. And if you're a shark that was eating in Hawaii, you would be red. And that circle represents basically right in the middle. And if those sharks were eating a little bit of everything, they would be exactly in the middle. That's what they'd be showing. But it turns out that sharks are actually way closer to California. They're eating twice as much food in California as they are in the cafe. So it suggests that these animals, the white sharks, are not going out to the cafe to eat. There's some other resource that they're leaving the California current for to find in the middle of nowhere. And so that jived with sort of what we understood about the white shark's use of the coastline. And so this is a picture of a shark when it first comes back from that offshore migration. As you can see, it's really skinny. And we look at body conditions. So if you look at the height of that dorsal fin, which doesn't change no matter how much food you've eaten or not, that dorsal fin is a static size. We compare that to the size of the body. And then we do that same thing later on. And so this is the same shark about 6 or 8 weeks later, which is pretty telling about how much those animals are eating and how much energy that they're taking on. So they get back from their cruise out to the cafe and they're super skinny, that picture on the left. Then they hang out for a few months and all of a sudden, boom, they're a lot bigger. So it indicates to us that yes, this is a really crucial part of their life cycle where they're foraging. And so this matches up with the isotopic signature we saw, that they weren't really eating offshore. They're skinny when they get back, but they're bulking up when they get to the California current. That's what we saw in the isotopes, that they're doing most of their feeding in the California current. Excuse me. So we want to understand a little bit more about that feeding. We say, all right, well, these changes in the girth of those animals indicates that they're feeding. But how do we understand about what those rates are and how much they're actually feeding? And so in comes another new technology, and this is called a biologging tag or a camera tag. And what's really cool about these is that they the same way that the satellite tag did, it records all the information, but this takes a huge number of different types of data streams. And so if you look at all the things that are on here, you'll notice that there's a camera. So there's a camera embedded in this, and then a logger. And inside that logger, there's three-dimensional accelerometers, three-dimensional gyroscopes, magnetometers, depth and temperature sensors. And basically these, what we call inertial sensors, allow us to, with really fine scale, look at the behavior of these animals. So as an animal is swimming, the accelerometers can basically follow the tail beats of the animal. The same way that your watch or your phone is going to count your steps, we can use these tags to count the tail beats of the animal, of how it's basically articulated in the water, if it's heading towards the surface or down. And at that same time, we can see what the animal sees to see how it's interacting with, say, bait, or with other sharks, or with its environment. And then this whole thing is set on a clamp, which you see these metal arms there. And so it basically, I guess here's one of the tags here. It basically clamps onto the dorsal fin as the shark swims by, and then it stays on until these magnesium sleeves, after a few days or a few weeks, degrade in the water like an Alka-Seltzer does, and then the whole thing pops up when we go collect it. And so this is just a figure, or just a short video of doing this in South Africa. You'll see that's me laying down with the clamp. We bait the shark towards the boat. As it comes by, we clamp that on, and then that shark carries on with its normal behavior for the next few days to few weeks to show us what they're doing. And remember, we wanted to understand how they were interacting with their environments and how they were interacting with each other, but we were also looking at how much they're foraging. We think that this coastal period is about foraging. So we put these tags on. What does it show us? It shows us that they do interact with prey. And this is a quick video from South Africa. You see the shark swimming around. There's seals that come down on the right side. There's a seal there, and there's a few seals on the bottom of your screen. And they start blowing bubbles at the shark. And what we actually found out is that there's this idea that sharks would not go into kelp. And some of you might be divers and surfers and things like that, like I am. And you heard this sort of old adage that if you ever need to seek refuge, if you see a white shark, you can go into the kelp, because they tend not to go into the kelp. But we found out that that's actually not true, and that's only by having these cameras on the animals. So we found out that they're actually using the kelp for a specific hunting strategy. So they'll see the seals and they'll actually corral them in the kelp, and then when the seals go up to breathe, then the sharks pursue them there. So we started to see that they are interacting with prey in the coastal ecosystems as we had expected. But after about 450 hours of video across South Africa, Cape Cod, California, we saw one single predation event in that entire time, which is an incredible amount of time to go with video without seeing any predation events happening. So this was a really interesting moment for us to say, we know from all of these other data streams that this is where foraging is happening, but it is a really rare event. So for those of us that are surfers or water users or beach users, and anyone who was listening when I was talking about attacks, is that this is one of those things that adds to that sort of helps you feel better about being in the water, because even in places where they're interacting with prey, they're seeing prey, they're supposed to be foraging, there was only a single foraging event that happened in all of those hours. So we understand that coastal period is where they're foraging. It's not very often, but it is the majority of the foraging that they're doing. So let's go back to that cafe. What is it that they're doing in that offshore area? And this next figure is going to be a little bit busy, but just sort of bear with me for a few seconds. So this picture is showing basically locomotory patterns or activity. And so if we close our eyes, instead of looking at the figure, we can all imagine that when you look outside and you see a bird flying from tree to tree, that they flap their wings, or a lot of them will flap their wings, and then they'll tuck them and they'll sort of glide down, and then they'll flap and they'll glide and flap and they'll glide. And that's what's represented in this top part with the bird here. So you can see that the bird is the The oscillating back and forth is basically the wing beats, and then the bird is going up while it's beating its wings, and then it's gliding down when it holds its wings in and then beats its wings and glides in. So this is a very well-conserved behavior, whether it's a bird or it's an animal. So it's an animal in the air or it's an animal in the ocean. So this same type of thing happens whether you're a bird or you're a marine mammal or a shark. And we see that these animals they'll swim towards the surface, and then they'll stop paddling and they'll glide down, and they'll swim to the surface and glide down. And that allows them to save energy. So we expect that a shark, as it's traveling or going about its day, that it's going to be doing these oscillations where it paddles up and paddles down and paddles up, or sorry, it doesn't paddle down, it paddles up and then glides down. And that's what we see for the most part, except when the animals get to the White Shark Cafe. And so this is a plot of vertical velocity. So if we took out the horizontal side-to-side movement at all and just looked at how much the animals are going up and down, the cafe is happening, remember, when they're offshore during that sort of April to July period. And that's the exact time that the vertical velocity, so that how fast they're going up and down, changes. So the rest of the year, they're just doing that sort of paddle up and glide down. When they get to the cafe, they're doing this very fast swim up to the surface and very fast swim down to the bottom. They do it up and down 300 meters, about 150 times a day. And this is mainly only done by males. So females are still doing a different pattern, but the males are doing what we call a rapid oscillatory dive that only happens in the cafe. And this was one of the biggest clues that we got about what's happening there. And you might say, well, why is a white shark swimming up and down a bunch of time in the water column? And remember, males are doing it and females are not. And you would expect if it was a food resource that they would both be exploiting it. They'd both be doing, whether you're male or female, you're doing the same thing. But it's different based on sex. And this comes to what I like to call is the pancake hypothesis. So females in a lot of species of sharks, when they are ready to mate, will release a pheromone. And so a pheromone is basically just a smell. And so she'll release that smell into the water. And if you've ever been diving or swimming in deep water, you know that the ocean is made up of different layers. And you'd feel that if you go through what we call a thermocline, which is change in temperature. So if you ever go into deep water and you swim down 20 feet, the temperature changes. And so the ocean is basically not this uniform mixed body, but it's more like a bunch of pancake layers. And those pancake layers don't mix with one another sometimes. So if a female is down at one of those deep pancakes and she's releasing a pheromone, imagine that you have a bunch of pancakes and imagine instead of a pheromone that was syrup, and I only put syrup on one of those pancakes and you didn't know where it was. The best way for you to guarantee that you could take a bite and get syrup in that bite would be to cut all the way down and take a little piece of each of those individual pancakes. You would be guaranteed to get a little bit of syrup in that bite. And that's the same thing we think is happening with males. They are searching for the females by cutting down all those different pancake layers of water to try to find that pheromone syrup in order to find a mate. So that is currently our best guess about what's happening in the cafe. There's some other things I can talk about, but I'll sort of leave it at that so I can get back to some Oregon things. So just a little recap is that these animals are, they're along the California current. So again, this is from basically Baja up to Nia Bay and heading out to the cafe, from foraging on the along the coast to probably mating in the offshore. That's my little quick blurb catch up of what we've talked about so far. But now I wanted to talk about one sort of bit about white sharks that's a little bit tangential to this, but I thought being in the Pacific Northwest would be really kind of a cool addition on, and that is this thing we call Intraguild predation. And this is because when we think about white sharks, we think about them as this apex predator. But we have to remember that they're not actually the apex predator in the oceans. And so this figure shows the distribution. So on the right side, those different colors, so the distribution of 3 different species, which is elephant seals in purple, white sharks, which is in green, and then orcas, which are in gray. And on the left side there, it shows the seasonal periodicity of that. So in the purple, again, you see the elephant seals are seasonally present along the coastal region in that sort of March, April, May season. They go away and they come back in the fall. White sharks are, as we talked about before, present in the fall. And then the orcas have a sort of a bimodal, so early in May, June, and then again in the fall. And so we see that all three of those spatially and temporally overlap in the fall. And to catch you all up, you probably all know this, being in the Northwest, I think everybody knows a lot about killer whales, is that there's three different main ecotypes, or different types or kinds of orcas that we sort of talk about. There's this group of residents, which are the fish eaters. There are transients, which are the marine mammal eaters, and then there are offshores, which are a group of or an ecotype that's been more recently described, and those animals are elasmobranch hunters, specialists, I guess you would say, and they have specific dentition and morphology that allows them, and behavior that allows them to focus on those different animals. And so in California, where we work, there's this very, as we talked about before, predictable presence of sharks at the coast. And so the orange and the blue and the green just show that those acoustic data. Remember the tags that we had that just showed the presence absence. That shows that the normal presence absence of those white sharks at these different sites in California. So blue is Año Nuevo, orange is the Farallones, and then green is Tamales Bay. And so that's what it normally looked like. But in 2009, a pod of transient orcas, which in California, transients also eat sharks, it's sort of confusing. But a group of transient orcas came through and killed a white shark. And at that moment, basically all of the sharks left the area. And so this is right here, you can see that is the moment that it happened. And so the sharks were doing their normal thing. They had come in, they were hanging out at the Farallon Islands, and boom, all of a sudden the orcas showed up and all of the sharks left. And then some of them went and ended up recruiting to other locations. So someone went to Año Nuevo. But because these orcas came through just for a few hours, they displaced those sharks for the entire rest of that year. So all of the sharks that were there distributed other places. We heard from them or saw them later on, so they had all survived, but the orcas themselves had displaced them. That also, because the orcas were there and then left, that meant there were no predators left for the elephant seals that were on the island. So the elephant seals ended up rebounding incredibly high that year because there were no sharks and there were no orcas to feed on them. So Intraguild is animals that fill the same sort of ecological role. And so this is white sharks and orcas fill the same sort of role, but it turns out that orcas are above the white sharks. And so they actually can predate on the white sharks and just displace them from their normal habitats. And this is each of those lines from left to right is an individual shark, and the orange spots of those detections at the Farallones that just showed at that moment at time 0, all of the white sharks basically disappeared from the Farallones and went to other places. And there's a few that scattered back, and if anybody has questions about those, I can talk about that later. But I just want to leave it that the orcas basically displaced, even though the orcas were there for about 2 hours, they displaced all of the sharks for the next 9 months. Okay, so that is my background about white sharks and some of the research that we've done in the past. And so these are the same populations again that are moving up, but we're trying to understand what they're doing here in Oregon as well as some other species. So I wanted to talk about that work and what's really exciting about the coast of Oregon. So in Oregon, everything we think about the ecosystems, our coastal ecosystems, sort of starting with salmon. So if we took this very salmon focused view and wanted to say, what is a food web of the Pacific Northwest, salmon being at the base of it, we'd say, well, all right, there's the salmon predators, which are your resident killer whales, other marine mammals, so harbor seals, sea lions, fur seals, stellars, things like that. Birds, another big predator of salmon, especially as they're out migrating smolt. And then us, right? humans are another big predator on this system. And so this is historically how we've thought about, a very simplified, but how we thought about the food web structure in off the Oregon coast, Oregon and Washington, I should say. And so this is just a little depiction of it, what we would historically think about what the food web is, but there's big parts of this that we're missing. And there's these really big coastal species that likely have a big effect on these systems. And so these are the three that my lab is working on now. And that's the Broadnose Sevengill shark, the white shark, and then the salmon shark. And I'll talk about each of those independently now. And so the Sevengill, and this is a project that's led by Jess Schulte, and this is, Sevengills are a big, basically ectothermic predators, so a little bit different than a white shark, where they're the same temperature as the water column. And these ectothermic predators they're about 3 meter maximum size. They live in basin estuaries, and then they'll get out to about the near coastal, so maybe down to about maybe 400 or 500 feet. And they can hunt individually, but they can also hunt cooperatively to take down larger marine mammals. So they fill that same sort of ecological niche as a white shark does. And so we're studying these, their movements, their behaviors, and what role that they have in these coastal marine ecosystems. And so what role do they have in the number of salmon that are in migrating to these bays and estuaries that they hang out, as well as the smolt that are going out the other way. And we know that they're here seasonally, and then they make these movements probably down to California, into the Bay Area, and even further down south to San Diego. But again, things that we don't necessarily fully understand yet. Another project we have going, which is led by Dr. Alex McInturf, she's a postdoc in the lab, is understanding salmon sharks. So salmon sharks are awesome because they are a relative of the white shark. They're endothermic in the same way that white sharks are. So they can be as far as the Aleutian Islands, the Bering Sea, and be about 20 plus degrees Celsius above ambient water temperature. And so this is a picture of one with a camera tag going back in the water. And so what Alex is looking at is how these animals basically interact with salmon in our environment and how they move, and what that distribution is from Alaska all the way down to Baja. And just some little bit of information about these sharks is that they grow to about 250 centimeters total length. They said their regional endotherms are warm-bodied, just like a white shark is. And we know that they are a significant consumer in other places of salmon. So they're thought to take about 12 to 25% of the annual runs of Pacific salmon in Alaska. And so one of the things is we're trying to understand what effect do they have on the fisheries here. So that's the next steps. And we know that they're here, and this is from some satellite tags. So these are just maps of the West Coast. And the blue here is on the left side is showing where they're transiting, moving around, and the green is where they're foraging. So you can see there's a lot of foraging that happens off of our coast here, as well as up in Alaska. And then on the right side, that's just what we call a kernel utilization distribution. So basically, the places where the color is brighter, is hotter, is where they spend more of their time. So you'll see one of those dots is right out outside of Newport, almost up to where you all are up in Seaside. So we know they're here, but we know little about them. Another project we have is trying to understand the movement of white sharks as they come from California into Oregon. So I'm sure you all are aware that these animals are off our coast. There were just a couple that were sighted last week, and off of Newport and then off of Coos Bay. And so they're making these large scale migrations, and moving up the California coast into Oregon, into Washington is part of those migrations. We went through all of these different facts about these animals. And these are just some satellite tracks, the same thing that we used to find out they're going to the cafe. Those same technologies were showing us that these animals had been moving north into Oregon waters from California. So we know that they're coming up here both by visually seeing them and also from the tags that we put on these animals. And also know from other descriptors. And so these are my two boys that intrepid scientists came down to help me. And if anybody is queasy, I'm going to show a quick video of this sperm whale that was on the beach. It's a quick little video, but this is the indication that these sharks are along our coast. So this animal had about 45 distinct white shark bites in it. It washed up at Beverly Beach, which is just north of Newport, in January a few years ago. So this is a really solid indication that there are a good number of white sharks that are off our coasts, yet no one has really studied them or tagged them off here, which is what we're trying to do. So this is, again, this more sort of holistic version of a Pacific Northwest ecosystem or food web that we're trying to understand a little bit better in our lab. And part of that is understanding the movement. So we had those acoustic tags and we had the receivers at certain places in California. Our goal is to actually outfit the entire coast with acoustic tags so we can see how those sharks are moving, as well as any other species that has a tag in it. Groundfish, sharks, sturgeons, salmons, things like that, as well as animals that make their own sound, like somniferous whales. We do some work on other things like marine renewable energies, and this is led by Dr. Kyle Newton, basically seeing how magnetic fields affect the movement of animals. And so you can see on the bottom there is the map of the same place, and the bathymetry, which is the bottom substrate, looks very different than what the magnetic signature is. And so we're learning how animals are using those and how that might be affected by some of the renewable energy installations that are going in. So that's a pretty quick recap of some of the work that we're doing in Oregon. We do a lot of work other places, mantas, giant bluefins, and all sorts of billfish and things. So if you're interested in finding more out about what we do in the lab or have more questions for me, you can find us at the Big Fish Lab at OSU, as well as our Twitter and Instagram feed, which is big_fish_lab, which we put out a lot of information about what we're doing, about the science, about the people, and about the animals. So if you're ever interested to find out more about what's going on or have questions for us, we'd be happy to hear from you. So feel free to jump on and contact us. There's also some different popular media things that we've done that have actually brought science into Shark Week and National Geographic. So these are a couple of shows that we've done. These are also listed on the website. So if you want to learn more about some of the specific research and an even more long-winded version than me, feel free to check these out. And I'm happy to post these again later on. So that was a lot, very quickly. Hopefully you all were able to follow the jumping around from species to species, but want to say thanks to a lot of folks for helping out and this research. This is a huge collaboration with Stanford, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and a bunch of different entities. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there's time or interest.
Well, that was a lot of really great information. Thank you so much. I've always wondered about the Shark Cafe. I've heard about it, and yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. So we do have a couple questions.
Sure.
So the first one is from Michelle, who says, over the last 5 years or so, I've heard a lot about great whites being spotted in the mouth of the Columbia River from locals in the Astoria area, along with more orcas than are usually seen there. Are any thoughts on what might be bringing them into this area more now, or have they always been here and they're just being noticed?
That's a great question. So there's a couple parts about that that I'll try to peel away. One is that we know from tagging that salmon sharks have historically spent a lot of time off the Columbia. I mean, basically, capitalizing all the salmon runs and the staging area there. Salmon sharks are often mistaken for white sharks because they look incredibly similar. A full-grown adult salmon shark looks just like a juvenile white shark. So there's a chance that those animals are being mistaken for white sharks. But that's maybe one caveat about it. But we do know that white sharks, and there's so much stuff that I couldn't get into. Y'all would be here till tomorrow. But we know that climate change is changing water temperatures, and we've already seen a northward migration of white sharks on the East Coast that are starting to move further into Canadian waters, we think, with those warming waters. And in Southern California, where normally the pups are, the small ones that are heat limited, we've seen a movement of their basically available habitat go from Southern California, San Diego, Santa Barbara. Now that includes Monterey Bay, because water temperatures have been increasing in Monterey Bay, that they've now shifted their distribution north. So what we think is potentially happening, what we're trying to get in front of, is to understand if the adults are having that same northward distribution shift, so that we're actually possibly going to see more of these white sharks in our region over the coming years as water temperatures basically warm moving north. Because you can imagine that the Oregon and Washington coastline are so full of potential food for white sharks and very, we think, suitable habitat for hunting, that the one thing that might have been limiting them is temperature.
Okay, awesome. Another question is, why do we see so many immature salmon sharks washing up on Oregon beaches?
Okay, that's an awesome question. Yeah, so salmon sharks pups are, they're about yay big, and we get calls all the time that there's a baby white shark on the beach, because they do look similar, and it comes down to temperature and actually sickness. And so what we've seen is there's a paper by Aaron Carlisle and some other folks that looked at these strandings all along the coast. And what we think is happening so you can imagine that you're this little salmon shark the mother gives birth. And so the mother is this warm 25 degrees Celsius body, gives birth to a salmon shark that is now in colder water, but it needs to maintain that temperature. And so if you're swimming around in the water, you can basically, as soon as you get in contact with that cold water, you get cold shocked. And a lot of times that happens where they'll be in these warm pots of water, and slowly the cold water will basically shrink that warm pot more and more and more until that warm pot basically disappears. And then those salmon sharks get temperature stressed. And you say, all right, well, they're endothermic, they should be able to deal with it. Well, the thing about the temperature stress is that it basically compromises their immune system. And so a lot of these salmon sharks that we find on the beach, we think are temperature stressed, which then basically presents a perfect breeding ground for a bacteria in the brain that leads them to be lethargic, and then they can't navigate, they can't basically survive, and so they wash up on the beaches. So it's kind of like this double whammy with this brain bacteria and getting cold shocked that basically lands them on the beach. So these animals wash up on the beach, they look perfect, they're not emaciated, they look like a perfect shark, but they're disoriented and they end up on the beach because of those contributing factors.
Okay. And then a couple more questions just came in. So Mark
Sure.
says, how much population data on sharks by type that travel/live along the Oregon coast do we have? For example, what's the most prevalent or common shark off the coast, and what's the least common?
So we're talking about different species of sharks in terms of, or are we talking like size classes of?
I believe species.
Okay.
That's how I'm going to interpret it.
Okay. I don't think anybody can answer that question, but I'll throw it out there. I would guess that if we're talking about the larger coastal species, things like blue sharks are going to be one of the most abundant in some of the offshore waters and not going to be super close. And then I think coastally, probably Sevengills are going to be your most abundant shark. So the bays like Willapa Bay is kind of chocked full, but then you go down to a spot like Coos Bay, and we haven't found any there yet. It seems like a very similar system, but the animals aren't there. But where the Sevengills are, they are pretty thick. White sharks, we're probably talking about, handfuls of those animals, maybe 50 animals across our coastline across a year. So not a ton. And then salmon sharks are probably a little bit less than blue sharks, but again, they're staying a little bit offshore from where we are. And that's the best guess. There aren't data available to be able to estimate, because sharks they're not a commodity here. So there aren't really available data to say that, they're not caught in the fishery systematically or targeted in the fishery. So those data that we would have, if we were living on the East Coast, we'd be able to estimate abundance, but we can't do that. That's one of the sort of things that we're trying to do in the lab, is to just get some of that baseline information, because we don't have it from a directed fishery.
Okay. So Carrie says some of the most shocking white shark encounters in Oregon have happened in December, literally within like a week of each other. Is that a typical scenario for surfers in this area?
So we think that the sharks, so based on sighting data and some of the tagging data, that it seems that the sharks they almost have this this bimodal time where they come through in sort of September, October, and then they'll come through in sort of late December, January, as that's when they seem to be in the area. And you know, in terms of I think that the interactions have been so rare with people in the water that I don't know that I could really speak to any sort of like periodicity or whatever to interactions. You know, so was a week and a half ago, I got a phone call from Coos Bay, and I don't know if you all have seen, there's a video of a white shark eating a lingcod off a line in Coos Bay. And that same day, there was a white shark eating a lingcod off a line in Newport. So the chance of those almost exact things happening on the same day is really odd, and it's a different animal. It's a very similar sized animal, but a different animal because they're too separate for them for that animal to have made that movement that quickly. So I don't know, and it may just be those types of things that the availability of the water, you know, water being just right, like that happened to be in January, or sorry, in February or January, whatever day it was, January, I guess, perfectly dead calm, warm, sunny day, Friday, so people could take the day off and go out. So it just happened to be, it's probably human effect on that people saw them. The sharks had been there or had been around, but people hadn't been on the water because conditions weren't right.
Okay. And then another question from Katie. Do the sharks leave when the orcas come into the area or only after there's a predation event on the shark?
So yeah, so I realized I misspoke a little bit when I said that. So that interaction that I was showing from 2009, we don't know that there was a predation. We know that the orcas came through and they ate a couple sea lions because we saw sea lion parts float to the surface, but we don't know that they actually ate a white shark on that trip. Earlier in, I think it was 1999, their orcas did kill a white shark there. And so they saw the same type of disappearance of the sharks when the shark was killed. But we've seen a number of these events where the orcas come through and all of the white sharks disappear. And we can't definitively say that no shark was killed, but there was no indication that sharks in those instances had been killed. So we think it doesn't necessarily need that a shark gets killed for the sharks to leave, but there's some other thing. You know, just the presence of the orcas itself may be enough to drive the sharks away.
And a follow-up on that, can they tell the difference between the different orcas?
So that's a really good question. And we're still trying to understand how they even figured out that the orcas had been there. So as y'all know, the mammal eating orcas will go silent when they start hunting. And the Farallon Islands is a big enough area that the sharks would not have been able to visually see the orcas. They obviously would not have been able to hear the orcas, but somehow they all figured it out. All 18 of them that we had tagged there figured out within 7 hours to leave the area. And there's enough current that it was blowing in a different direction that it wasn't like they smelled the orcas in the water. So there's some type of communication that's happening, or some type of I guess it is have to be some type of communication that's happening that the animals are figuring out to leave. So we don't even know what that communication is between the sharks, let alone what it is about the orcas. Pete Clemente did a study of about 30 years ago where he dressed in a wetsuit that looked like an orca and then played orca sounds to sharks to see if it would scare them. Unfortunately, it was sharks that were lemon sharks that I don't think had ever evolutionarily seen orcas. So it was kind of it wasn't possibly the best experimental design, but I don't know that there's been any test that the specific calls of different groups this is a really long way to say this. I don't think there's specific evidence to show that there's that they respond differently to different groups, but it would be something cool to try to do to play those sounds back.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all the great information. I think that's all our questions. We really appreciate it. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm gonna have to go back and watch it again because there's so much great info. And if anyone does want to go back and watch this presentation again, or send it to anyone who is a shark lover in your life or shark fearful, make sure to check out our Facebook because it will continue to live there, but it will also be on our YouTube page as soon as I get my act together and put it up there. So thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.